Great. Well, it's a joy to be back and sharing some more with you. And as I mentioned at the end of the last session, God really spoke to me about a particular warrior tribe that lived on the edge of the Negev in South Israel called the Amalekites. And as I mentioned, I had been meeting with, over the months with a group of businessmen and women and professionals of one sort or another. And it was very interesting to me that some of them really came to see this as a community, even though one of them called it a church, even though we were focused, but they found a quality of life and fellowship and sharing in that environment which had been very life-giving for them. And at a particular point I was praying, and God just said that the spirit that attacks Christians in the marketplace is the spirit of Amalek. And I really didn't know what that was, so I decided to study, to look up the reference to the Amalekites in the Bible. And they as I've said, were a tribe of people that lived in southern Israel on the edge of the desert. And they were actually descendants of Esau. So, Edom and Israel didn't have the most fraternal of relationships, really. They were continually in conflict. And the Amalekites started that conflict, that aggression. And the first reference we have to them as a tribe is in the book of Exodus. And you know the story, even though you may not remember that it was the Amalekites that were in it. But the story was when Moses when there was this conflict, this battle, and a people attacked Israel in the wilderness. It's the only occasion. In all their wanderings, only once were they attacked. And it was by this group, the Amalekites. And Moses positioned himself up a mountain, you recall that, and his role was to pray. And Joshua rallied the Israeli army, and they fought the Amalekites in the valley. And when, just again showing how we need to work together in team. The team was really important. And when Moses was able to lift his hands in worship, Israel prevailed. But when he let them down because they were getting tired, the Amalekites prevailed. So he recruited two of his priests, his brother and cousin or whatever, Aaron and Hur, to hold up his hands while he continued to pray so that victory could be won. And that is the first reference to the Amalekites. But that's in Exodus 17, verses 8 onwards. And then in Deuteronomy 25, Deuteronomy, just to give you a bit of background, was the summary that Moses gave at the end of his life of all the events of the wilderness years. So it was him recapping the different events from coming out of Egypt to the giving of the law. That's, I think, in Deuteronomy 5. And then what those laws were. And at the very end of his book, in chapter 25, he makes a very clear instruction, verse 17, to the nation of Israel. And he says to them, when you come into the land, destroy the Amalekites. And why did he tell them to do that? Well, he said, they attacked you in the wilderness and attacked you in the rear to take out the weak and the vulnerable and the weary. So they were coming up behind Israel and trying to attack the exposed rear, where the weak and the vulnerable and those who were not able to sometimes keep pace with the rest of the tribe as they walked were located. And later on, much later on, we see them again. And at one point, Saul attacks the Amalekites, but he doesn't destroy them all, even though he may have thought he did. He leaves the king, which was a bad move, not a good idea. But then also, he clearly left a whole group of this lot, because later on, David is in Ziklag, and now he's now seeking refuge in Philistia, from Saul, who's been chasing him around the southern edge of Israel for 15 years. And he's become to get a little weary, so he changes allegiances and joins the Philistines. And he lives in this city. And so he's gone off with all his warriors to fight against Israel with the Philistines, which God fortunately prevents him from doing. But while he's away, guess what happens? You know the story. Somebody attacks Ziklag and takes all the women and children. And who were they that did the attacking? The Amalekites. So David was able to go after them and rescue everyone, but, you know, in the meantime, his troops talked of stoning him. So he has to, at the end of 1 Samuel, he has to encourage himself in the Lord because there's nobody else around to do it for him. And he gets given understanding. He calls for the priest, and God speaks to him, and victory is eventually won. But that is the spirit of Amalek. It attacks the weak, the weary, the stragglers, the women, and the defenseless. So when God spoke to me so clearly that Christians are attacked by the spirit of Amalek when they go to work, I knew exactly what he was trying to say. They go to work alone. Now, I think I just am prompted to interject a story at this point. I was asked by one of you earlier about giving some practical things of what you can do. A number of years ago, I was in Germany when I'd started to teach on this stuff. And I was preaching in Germany, and I was at a church that I'd visited before, and I met a chap called Thomas. And I gravitated to Thomas because he spoke good English, and you know, I don't mind being in countries where I don't really speak the language. It gives you a chance to kind of get your own thoughts together for a while, which sometimes is a good thing. But I had a chat to Thomas, so I asked him what he did. And he said, well, I work for Valeo. Now, if you've had any European car or French car, you probably bought a part made by Valeo. It makes huge numbers of car parts, and it's a French company. And he was German. He lived just outside Stuttgart, and their German manufacturer had been bought out by this French concern. And he spoke good English because, interestingly, they did everything in English. And so I then asked him, well, how many people are you responsible for? Because he was in senior management. And he said, I have 2,300 employees in three factories or sites that are accountable to me. So that's quite a lot of people. And one of them was research and development, and at the time, this was a number of years ago, they were teaching cars or doing the stuff around helping cars identify the lines down highways, because most people die in Western nations, especially in America, through falling asleep at the wheel. So they wanted to design a method of incapacitating that vehicle if you continually go over a line, and making sure that you wake up or have a rest somewhere nearby, because clearly you're not really fit to drive. So that was his research arm. So he had 2 plants in Germany and 1 in Hungary, and traveled a lot, often to Paris, to the headquarters, and down to his Hungary plant, and everything. So I asked him, I said, Thomas, does anybody pray for you? And he said, well, I'm sure my pastor does. And I knew his pastor. He was really a gracious man. And I said, where does he pray for you? And he said, well, he's never been to my plant, to my office. And I said, well, that's the problem. Somehow I just know that it's important to pray people for their work in situ, in their situation, in their place of work. There's got to be an aspect in which that is done. Even if you're practical, if you're a plumber, you've got a bucky. You know what I'm saying? You can pray in the seat and bless. So I said to him, have you got anybody praying with you in your office? And he said, no. And I said, you've got a church or kingdom sphere of 2,300 people and no one's prayed for you in your office. I said, start a prayer meeting. That's my advice. Start a gathering, find just a handful of Christians out of the 2,000 odd that you've got, and ask them to meet with you periodically and pray. So anyway, I left, and that was my suggestion. So I was, coincidentally, I was back in the same church a year later. And I really, a year I forget completely, A, the person's name usually, and B, what I've advised them. So he came running up to me when I came a year later, and he said, "Stephen, it works." So I said, "What works?" Because I'd completely forgotten what I'd advised him to do. He said, "Well, he advised me to pray." And I said, "Oh, yeah, that's right. What did you do? How did you go about it?" And he said, "Well, I found 4 people. I found a Catholic, 2 Lutherans, he was from Vineyard, and someone from something else. Maybe 2 Catholics, I can't remember." So he said, "We use the boardroom." So I said, "Well, how's that helped?" And he said, "Well, we meet every week. Sometimes I can't be there, but I've instructed my PA to open the boardroom, which is right next to my office." And he said, every week at 5 o'clock, they pray for half an hour. And recently, he said, I had an email from the Catholic who said, this has transformed his life. He comes to work with vision now. And the second thing he said, and we have exceeded our projections and our profitability in each of our departments for the last 4 quarters since we started doing this. In fact, we've outperformed all the other divisions of Valio. 5 people praying amongst 2,300. And then I said to him, "Well, that's fantastic. I celebrate with you." And he said, "There's one other thing. God has really given me a boldness." And I said, "That's brilliant. How's that worked out?" And he said, "Well, I was concerned about some of the words I was hearing coming out of the mouths of my senior management, some of the swearing and some of the inappropriate language." So then I said, "Well, what did you do about it?" He said, "Well, God just spoke to me. He gave me a strategy." He said he wrote down on paper, got his secretary to type out some of the more choicest swear expressions that these men had said, and print them out on A2 and put them around the boardroom before a board meeting with his senior managers. Right? So all these men traipse in, and it's a car manufacturing company. They can be a bit rough around the edges, green behind the gills, as they say. So they all traipse in and they see these words that each of them have said or heard said. And my friend Thomas, he just stops. And they're all looking at this and wondering what's going on. He just said, "Gentlemen," he said, "I don't like working in this environment. I want it to stop now." Change your language. Let's work in a pleasant environment. That was it. That's all he had to say. And he said, from that moment on, in each of his divisions, on the floor, everywhere, he noticed a completely different language being spoken. There was less swearing, there was less negativity, there was less, unpleasantness. All because of one simple action that took 5 minutes to put together. All because 5 people were praying for 2,300. So I realized that God wants to change our work environments. And he wants to give us simple strategies. And he wants to help us really engage with our world of work. Now, there are a number of strongholds that we as the church have embraced. And I'm going to be talking about 5 that God's shown me. 2 in this section and 3 in the final session, which we will have in a little while. And a stronghold, the nearest stronghold that you have here, to here I guess, is Zimbabwe ruins. I don't know if any of you have been there. But it was normally, in England there are a number. And they were built from the Bronze Age onwards. And in Britain, in Zimbabwe, you've got a natural rock fortification, and they just built defenses around it up in the mountain or in a Isselberg. It's spectacular. But in England, they had to take more of an effort because Often they didn't find something that was naturally so defendable. And there's one fairly close to where I used to live, where I grew up, called Sisbury Ring, which is a Bronze Age fortress. And south of where I lived is a range of hills called the South Downs, which are chalk. And so the rock is soft. And they would find a suitable hill and dig a trench all the way around the top of it. And then they would build a palisade with timber sticking outwards and other defenses. And they would often sink a well in the top there so that they could keep their flocks and their herds, and they had water, so they could last out against an attacking force for quite some period of time. And the problem with any stronghold, and Paul uses the word in 2 Corinthians 10, he tells us we are to destroy speculations, strongholds, and every lofty thought raised up against the knowledge of God. So the problem with a stronghold is you've got this group of opposing force on the top of this hill. And you can't just ignore it. If you try and go by it and take more territory, they're going to attack your supply lines and attack you in the rear, like the Amalekites did to the nation of Israel. So you actually have to tear this thing down. You have to take it out. And so the last great battle between the Romans and the Brits, the ancient Brits just early AD years, 43, 44, they were taking down a stronghold in the Midlands of England, close to where my sister and mother live now. And that was, again, built around the top of a hill, and with strong fortifications, and the Romans had to take this thing out because they had these enemies up there, this king of a region, and he would cause great damage to their attempts to bring order and governance and build and plant and sow in this new land. So similarly with the believer, we have these things that the enemy has set up in our heads. I mentioned in one of the last sessions that there is a tendency to read through things and not to see and to be influenced by those strongholds. So we just don't see stuff. It took me a long time to realize that God had made the world good but not perfect. So we tended to say God made a perfect earth. It was complete, didn't need anything. Well, that's not true. Because God wanted man to participate in the creation. God gave us the world to live and to cultivate and to govern, and he's consistently wanted mankind to participate in that process. And that's why, to redeem it, there was a man who came, God in the flesh, right? To enable us, through his agency, with his sacrifice, with his empowering spirit, to reclaim that which the enemy has corrupted and man has abdicated. Amen? So this is the world in which God has given us to operate. And some of these strongholds, some of these structures are really quite difficult to deal with. You are not going to deal with them unless you renew your mind and there is a measure of repentance for wrong thinking of the past. Because we've all had it. And that's how you tear up a stronghold spiritually. You recognize you've been in error. God, I hadn't seen this. I'm sorry. I have taught, I have lived this error, and I want now to change. Please forgive me. And then you have to rethink what God has said. And you have to re-engage with Scripture to really get a hold of God's purpose and intent for you in that journey and in that process. So one of the principal sources of some of these errors is 2,000 years old. Came into the church in the 3rd century, called Gnostic thinking, which I'll touch on aspects of it. But let me just give you some example. In the Hebrew language, there is no word for spiritual. Because all of life, however mundane, however everyday, however, even, private, was considered spiritual. They had no distinction between the ordinary world of everyday practical life and their spiritual lives. They saw them as completely married and harmonious together. The Greeks, on the other hand, the Gnostic thinking separated what they considered spiritual from what they considered unspiritual. We call that in the church today the sacred-secular divide, which I will talk about. So this problem has led to many believers being compartmentalized in their lives. Or the modern word is siloed. So we're spiritual on Sunday because we go to a spiritual place. And we go to lift our hands and we go to worship and we go to listen to the Bible, which is spiritual, right? Because God gave it to us. But when it comes to Monday, we're not spiritual anymore. Because we know we're church on Sunday, because we're with the people and we listen to singing nice songs and we're talking about Jesus and we shake hands and we all smile and we love one another and it's all wonderful. But on Monday, we don't know how to fit that into spiritual life. There's been this challenge or struggle. And we might have been told 100 times by well-meaning pastors, church leaders and others, teachers, no, well, your work is just as important as what you do on Sunday. But actually, many of them don't live it. I've been into numerous pastors' meetings, as has Craig, I'm sure. And what is inevitably at some point, the conversation will go around how their meeting was on Sunday or what God's doing in their church. Now, what do they mean by what God's doing in their church? They mean by what happens on Sunday morning or in the building that they designate as a church, right? That's what they mean. So they're not thinking about the spirituality of their people on Monday and how that needs to impact the world. They're really thinking about bringing all of life into their church building because this is where the kingdom is worked out for us. And that really has prevented most Christians really engaging with their spiritual destiny and calling. Because to the Hebrew, whether you were a road sweeper or a missionary in New Guinea amongst a head-hunting tribe, everything is spiritual. And somehow we need to restore this. So as I teach on these strongholds, I want you to think a little bit about where you've got this wrong in your own life, right? And what we need to do to re-engage with what the Bible actually teaches so that we can see this in a different way. And I'm very grateful to people I've read, to books I've drawn from. John Stott and set up an organization in London a number of years ago. He was an Anglican minister and a godly man, and led a church for many, many years in the center of London. And one of the things that caused him to start this ministry is that he was dealing with people who were really quite privileged, because he was in the center of London in a place of some wealth and means. And many of his people who were in his church, you know, they were bankers and lawyers and stockbrokers and really men of some capacity. And some actually lived, you know, had second homes somewhere else and often with families somewhere else. So he realized that these people were working in their secular world of work and often having huge responsibility. But then they would go home and go to church, and often the message that they were hearing was completely irrelevant to what they were doing on Monday and had really no bearing at all. Often they were commuting all the way down to, you know, some nice Sussex village, and then where their family was, and they would go into a local rural Anglican church and get a message. And it was completely removed from, you know, moving funds from Singapore to Hong Kong, which they were needing to do on Monday morning as soon as, you know, the markets opened, because they wanted to save themselves X billion. You know, so these sorts of worlds are very, very removed. And so he started a network of meeting places in restaurants and bistros in the city and in central London, where these folk could gather in small groups and discuss their lives. because then they would find people who could identify, who shared some of the same pressures, who had some of the same issues that they were challenged by and dealing with, and they could find a place of fellowship and life which was far more real to them than going into the meeting on Sunday morning. And so, this became a life-giving source to many of these Christian, professionals. And so he then formed that into an organization called London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, which you can still download materials from, and some of which I've incorporated in one way or another in what I've put together. But normally they do it at a somewhat more simple and basic level than I'm even attempting to do it today. So let me have a look at some of these strongholds, and we're going to look at 2 to start with, and then we'll look at 3 in the next section. The first one is we have a false understanding of what the kingdom really is, or as I call it, a flawed missiology. Now, that means that we fail to embrace the totality of Christ's kingdom. Now, if I talk about heaven and hell, most Christians and most people will immediately separate heaven and hell from them in both space and time. So, heaven is up there somewhere, and it's in the future, right? And hell is down there somewhere, and we don't want to go there, and that will be revealed to those who don't make it up there, right? And that's also in the future. But Jesus, when he came, he said, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. In fact, he went as far as to say, if I cast out demons by the finger of God, the kingdom of heaven is among you. So Jesus came in response to the heart's cry of an oppressed people as a king. But he didn't come to bring the kind of kingdom that they were looking for. He came to bring a fundamentally different kingdom that wasn't just going to redeem Israel, it was saving a whole world. And he came to introduce a new kingdom that would transform all of earth, not just give Israel, as a nation and a small people, a place of preeminence and authority and a rulership that they'd once enjoyed under David. So when Jesus came and said, I come to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth and I am the king, they didn't get it because they were looking for a different type of king. But that was the kind of kingdom that Jesus was bringing. So he was saying, I am coming out of here, and I've come to here to bring there here. Right? To bring there here. So when I cast out demons, when I heal the sick, when I raise Lazarus, it's a symptom or a sign or a demonstration of what life's like up there. When I feed the multitudes, there's no one who's hungry there. When I heal the sick, there's no one who's sick there. And I'm bringing that life here. And I want you to enjoy it, to feast on it, to taste and see that the Lord is good, but then to learn how to do it for yourselves so that you can multiply the influence of the kingdom and not wait for it one day, but bring it now, right? So most people don't bring the kingdom on Sunday morning when they're sitting in the church. That's not where you bring the kingdom, because hopefully the king is already ruling in most of the hearts there. Where you bring the kingdom is where you stretch your understanding, your knowledge, your capacity, use your muscles, use your time, use your skills, use your emotions to take something that is God has enshrined, placed in your life, in your heart, and you live it out in a community of people. And God doesn't want you to do that on your own. And we'll get to that one in just a few minutes. He wants you to do it with people, as my friend Thomas in Germany did. He just found 5 out of 2,300. God doesn't need you to find many, but he does need you to find 1 or 2 who can journey with you in your life. Now, another aspect of this is that mission, in most Christians' minds, is over there somewhere. Right? So mission, traditionally defined, was in darkest Africa or central Borneo or, in troubled China or wherever it was, and it was always over there. It was never here. So, you never thought of mission in Christian England or in Christian America. That just wasn't a part of it. We've already got kingdom. We've already got churches on every corner. Not that they were living it, of course, but that, you know. So mission became a distant people rather than God breaking in to all of life here and now by the agency of the church through the power of the Holy Spirit. So our mission, wherever it might be, is to bring to enable our God to break into our community, to break into life here and now by the agency of this thing that we call the church, by the power of the Holy Spirit. And that's what mission is, wherever it is. Around the corner, as Lauren Cunningham said, or around the world. Our call is to be missionaries everywhere all the time. So we've had a flawed understanding of kingdom and our mission. Secondly, Greek Gnosticism. Now, I've mentioned this before, and I'll talk a bit more about this. We have embraced from Greek Gnosticism a certain hierarchy, and it's worked like this. As I mentioned, to the Greeks, and then subsequently to the Gnostics, which had a profound influence on the church at a particular point in time. Not the early church fathers that we read in the Bible, but the following generations. This idea was that certain aspects of life are good and sometimes certain aspects are bad or irredeemable. And so that has basically meant that we see some things as spiritual and other things as not. Now, this worked itself out in the church very straightforwardly. I mean, I've been coming to Southern Africa since 1975. And I remember even relatively, in the 80s, when we first came in the 88, I went with my brother-in-law, who was at that point head of welfare in the AFM church. We went to an AFM church in Nelspruit. Very big. Now, guess what the people wore? Do you think there were suits to be seen? And ties? Yeah. Hats? Yes. Everybody got dressed up for Sunday. Why did they do that? Because Sunday was more spiritual than Monday. Now, my wife grew up in a family, which was in the AFM. She couldn't do homework on Sundays. She wasn't allowed to swim on Sundays. She couldn't go to a movie on Sundays. Because somehow it was viewed to be more spiritual and therefore set apart for holy works. And of course, everything else is unholy by inference. Now, so that's a generation away, but it's coming knocking on our door. So this is a stronghold that we really have to tear down. And it's really got bad because we have a hierarchy of vocations. We've come to view some types of work as more spiritual than others. So the most holy of all was some missionary like, well, I can name a few, who took their young family into Don Richardson, into a headhunting tribe in New Guinea to bring the gospel. They survived. They did great. He wrote a book called Eternity in Their Hearts, which is one of the best books you can ever read on mission. And so that's the most holy. And then you come down, you've got pastor and Bible school teacher. Well, they all make it, don't they? Don't they, Kenneth? And then you've got, start getting slightly less holy, but then you have a whole series of vocations, which we call jobs, which we call vocations, because we feel that people have a sense of call to do them, like doctors and teachers and nurses. So, often we paid them badly because they should be willing to work for nothing, but we pay them a little because they're helping. So those are vocations because they're helping others and they're serving people. But then you start getting down to a lower realm where people are actually just working for the money, right? For the filthy lucre, right? And then it goes on, it goes down and down and down. I mean, I don't know who's your bottom. I mean, You've got politicians or people who lie for a job. Maybe we could include some lawyers in that, and prosecuting lawyers or whatever else, or defense lawyers who know that they're deliberately defending somebody they know full well is as guilty as sin. So you know, we have this hierarchy, and there's always this striving to somehow jump up the ladder. So, I mean, I'd be a rich man if I could count the number of times that someone came to me and said, if I got paid for every time someone came to me and said, you know, I do this at the moment, but I'm working so that I can become financially independent so I can go full time. And you get these words, don't you? What does go full time mean? Well, it means that I can become one of those who's on the top of the pile and just serve what I conceive to be serving Jesus all the time. And of course, none of the others are, because they're not full time. And I mean, this is total heresy. The language we've adopted, the words we use, it frames a perspective which is the stronghold of our minds. So, you know, I then often say to them, maybe they're in business, I say to them, what do you do? And they say, well, I have a business, I employ 25 people. And I say, well, look, if you don't pastor them, don't aim to be a pastor of a church of 500. They're your first church. They're the kingdom sphere that God's given you. That's your garden. Just as Adam was given a garden, we've all been given gardens. And they're in your garden. Reach out to these people, bring the life of God to them, demonstrate a different way of practicing your work, pay them promptly, pay them well, be kind, notice their issues, help them with their family concerns, listen to them when they've got problems, be a shepherd to them, take them into your heart, at times maybe even into your home, make them feel a part of your life. Right? That's called bringing kingdom. Isn't that what Jesus did? He came into our world. He walked the streets with us. When we needed it, he healed us. He fed us. He taught the word to us so that we would have the truth and the principle. And he treated us with respect and esteem. So I've recognized that we have these fundamental problems in our heads that we need to get rid of. This word going full time is one that I have a particular ambivalence towards because it is such nonsense. And to be frank, I've used it. So it was a stronghold in my mind because I was sucked into the same things. Now I just don't even go there. You know, if I find somebody using the language, I try and correct them, which some people find really hard. And in this continent, sadly, some people think that's the only place up there is to make money. You know, they're not the chief. They're not the chief's son. They're not on his eldership. So let's start a church because at least then we've got our captive little tribe and we can milk them for their resources. And that is just fundamentally ungodly. That's not being full-time at all. That's being a stumbling block to people finding Christ. And you know what Jesus said about that. So that's the first two. We will have a short break now and come back in a moment or two. And then I will give you the other final three strongholds that grip the head of the church and stop us from being the people that God calls us to be in our places of work. Amen.